Hello, this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen. Welcome back if you've been here before. And if you have been here before, and if you were here a couple of episodes ago, you would have heard my guest, Marek Khan, come in to talk about his newly reissued cult classic, Dope Girls, a terrific book which opens our eyes to the real origin of the drug laws in the UK, and probably paralleled in many Western countries. In Dope Girls, Marek shows that a lot of our fears around drugs actually came from a time just after the First World War when people, men in particular, were afraid of the newly liberated young women, and there was, as there is now, a fear of the other, the immigrant, the wicked foreigner who was bent on seducing and corrupting not only those young women, but society itself. And I thought it would be good to expand that conversation even further with the publication, the reissue of another cult classic, Mike Jay's High Society, a book which sets our use or misuse of drugs into a vast landscape of history, geography and culture. If Mike's name is familiar to you, that's because he's been here twice before. He was right back in the early days when we were around the corner at Great Wimwell Street. He came to talk about mescaline, and more recently to talk about his book Psychonauts, a study of the men and women, mainly in the 19th and early 20th century, who were experimenting on themselves in the interests of furthering human knowledge. So we're very pleased to have him back for the third time. Before we do that, I'd just like to say thank you to my recent correspondent, Heather. Thanks for the suggestion about Prince Stash. I've heard that one before. I think it's definitely something I'm going to follow up on. Tony Thompson, who I met in Findhorn recently at a gig, the Waterboys gig actually. Terrific show. When Tony came up to me and we had a chat about all things counterculture. And in fact, I'm planning that we're going to be speaking to Mike Scott of the Waterboys, a deeply countercultural soul, later in the year. Also to Ronnie, my regular correspondent, to Stefan and to Kate. It's very good to hear from people. If you want to be in touch, you can check us out at bureauoflostculture.com. Send us an email with your suggestions and thoughts on the show. Now, back to it. As Stephen Duffy says, as I like to repeat, let's kick off our sandals, blow out the candles, lay back, turn on, tune in and drop out for this episode of the Bureau of Lost Culture. Well, I'm very pleased to welcome him back for the third time, Mike Jay.
Great pleasure to be here, Stephen, again.
Well, you know, Mike, you were one of our very first when you came here to tell the story of mescaline.
I guess that must have been like 2019 or something, probably 5 years ago now.
Quite a bit's happened since then, but you have been back because you came back to talk about your wonderful book, Psychonauts.
That was a great chat. I enjoyed that.
When we sort of found out how, I suppose, scientists were also artists. They were self-experimenting using various substances. And the sort of boundaries between who's a hippie, who's a head, who's a scientist, who's a nerd or an academic was much more blurred.
I mean, the science now, we all have to look at brain scans and talk about 5-HT2A receptors and, it's all kind of by proxy and one removed, and you're not really talking about the experience. So what's interesting about that earlier time is that if you were a scientist and you were interested in mind-altering drugs and what they did, then, route one was just to take them yourself and write the best description you could. So there's just this wonderful literature of self-experimentation back there that's such a contrast to where we are today.
I'll always remember, I don't think it was for psychoactive reasons, but you told me about the guy who injected himself in his own penis.
That was John Hunter. I mean, so much of medical science developed that way, at that time in the sort of 18th and 19th century. Famous scientists made great breakthroughs by, swallowing linen bags on a string and then regurgitating them to study how stomach acids worked, right. And all that, because there was no other way of doing it. And also, it was not ethical to, experiment on sick people. If you wanted to experiment on someone, just, do it on yourself.
I suppose there's a limit to what you can research by killing animals by experimenting on them too.
Yes, animals can't tell you about their state of consciousness or anything like that. So things like the discovery of anesthesia, all that was dentists and doctors and scientists just huffing on different solvents and gases and substances and finding out which were the ones that worked.
Well, bless them. They got us to where we are today. I hope to. But that's why we've already dived straight in. We're not actually here to talk about psychonauts directly anyway, and we're not here to talk about mescaline because we have done already, although, of course, both those things feature in your book, High Society, which we are going to talk about. Mm-hmm. Of course, this is a reissue. It came out in 2010 with that wonderful Wellcome Collection exhibition about the history of drugs in culture. That was when Wellcome was still doing great shows, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were having a bit of a magic decade, they did loads of really groundbreaking shows.
There weren't any mind-altering substances there, but the actual exhibitions were mind-altering, I thought, at that time. But at the time, I think also because you were working quite closely with them. Also, I mean, as well as all your writing, your journalism, and your own research, weren't you the sort of keeper of psychedelic plants at Kew Gardens? Or did I make that up?
I did work with Kew Gardens on a show about their psychedelic plants, of which they have a lot. They can wander around the cactus bit. If you know what you're looking for, you can spot a few mescaline-containing things there. But they also had...
Did they keep a very close eye on them?
Some of the things they had tucked away. They've got the most amazing peyote cactus, which looks like a little pincushion sort of thing. But then when you get old ones, and if they've got cut and damaged, then other ones will grow off them. So you get these ones that almost look like a huge, great sort of boulder of coral with hundreds of heads. And they've got one of those which they don't keep on display because correctly suspect that people might start nicking bits of it. So there was an excuse for them to get things like that out, and their cat plants and their opium poppies. And
Cat as in K-H-A-T.
That's right.
Yeah. I gave an introduction to you earlier on, and of course this book is the latest of several now that you've written on the subject of psychoactive substances, but also on sanity, insanity. It's going to cross over between these things. Artificial Paradise is The Influencing Machine. That's a terrific book. Emperors of Dreams, of course. How would you describe yourself? They say that you're a writer on the cultural history of science, medicine, and the mind. I don't think that quite sort of sums you up. Are you a psychonaut yourself?
Yes, I am. I mean, I guess that's in a way where I came into this territory, was writing about drugs back in the 90s when, in my world at least, everybody was taking them, but nobody was really writing about them, or if they did, it was like all drugs, problem, crime, addiction, and so I guess I get called a cultural historian, journalist with special interests that I've followed for a while.
It should be said about High Society, they've now been reissued with a new foreword by yourself and kind of revised to take account of the changing times. And it's only been 14 years, but things have changed a lot. But the book itself, like Dope Girls, because Marek Cohen came in a few weeks ago to talk about the revised edition of his cult classic, they were both books that were kind of a little bit ahead of their time, but they were not books which were commenting on whether drugs should be legal or not. They were not making a case for the legalizing of drugs. They were more taking the subject out of this very kind of narrow criminal world into a wider world of possibly medicine and health. And then, in your case, much wider out into the context of human culture and history.
That's right. Marek Cohen and I were probably coming from similar places at that point, because I think he wrote for The Face and stuff about drug culture in those early days. He's got very considerable chops as a scientist and as a historian. And with me, when I started writing about drugs for the youth and style magazines, particularly in my case, I was an early adopter of the internet. So suddenly there was this world where, as discussed, drugs were just a problem, and it was all just say no. Suddenly there was the internet, which was full of thousands of anonymous, but often extremely knowledgeable people around the world all sharing this information. That was the first stuff that I started writing about. But then, and I suspect Marek was similar, if you're writing about contemporary drug culture, then obviously the question comes up, well, where did these things come from? And, like everybody else, I grew up with this vague idea that drugs kind of materialised in the 60s from nowhere, and then you discover that actually these things we call drugs, whether you're talking about opiates or cocaine or cannabis, they all have very, very long histories, going back to different parts of the world, some of them going back to forgotten episodes in early Western science. And yeah, that's very much what Dope Girls is. It's, looking at the heroin epidemic that was surging through Britain in the 80s and 90s and going, well, where did this all start? And tracking it back to here in Soho, during the First World War.
Trying to establish where this is juncture between the use of drugs through culture and then the criminalisation of it, which is a very recent thing.
Yes, that's right.
In the history of these things, it's really in the last century. And in Marriage, Kiss and Dope Girls, he was pointing out that in this country, at least, the legislation was influenced by all sorts of things, including like the fear of what young women were turning into after the First World War and what these terrible foreigners, the Chinese, were doing. So you got fear of the other. And fear of change, which were propelling the laws as much as the potential harm that the substances could cause.
That's right. And then the question is, who's telling this story? And at that point, the history of drugs, in as much as it was part of the history of medicine, was all being told very top down. Everybody who was studying it was studying how the concept of addiction developed. Nobody was looking at drug users and their experiences and the world that they were living in. So it seemed to me that was the story just needed to be told, from a different perspective.
So let's start telling that story, or let me start asking you questions about the story. And I thought we'd start off with an easy one, just to warm you up, Mike. Why do we take drugs?
That old chestnut. Yeah, that's a question I've kind of championed from early on, rather than kind of, who are these other people who take drugs and what should we do about them? Instead of let's admit that we all pretty much take drugs one way or another.
And listen, I just want to jump in there before Mike continues, because we all drink coffee, we overuse sugar, there's lots of other substances, whether they be illegal or not, which all of us take, right?
Yeah, that's right. The word drugs, in the sense that we're using it now, that was not a word that existed until the 20th century. It just described everything that you'd buy in a chemist, which at that point included cocaine and cannabis and heroin and whatever. So it was only when they got taken out of that, they got called drugs in inverted commas with a sort of very pejorative meanings attached, criminal, foreign, dangerous, addictive. But mind-altering drugs, is really what we're talking about. Right. But of course, not all mind-altering drugs. We don't talk about a cup of tea or a glass of wine as a drug. You could do, but you'd be kind of making a point. We're talking about mind-altering drugs, but also ones that are, in a way, somehow socially disapproved. They are pretty much of a human universal. Pretty much every culture throughout history and around the globe, has, what we would call, looking at them, drugs. The drugs of our own culture are kind of invisible, like caffeine and alcohol are to us.
Tobacco.
And I think the same is true for sort of chewing coca leaf or betel nut or whatever.
So you said every society is a high society.
Mm-hmm.
Every day people drink coffee on European terraces, chew betel nut in Indonesian markets, take coca leaf on Andean mountainsides, and smoke tobacco in every nation on earth. Getting high has been a pursuit of civilisations throughout time. Mm-hmm. Mind-altering drugs have been part of virtually every human culture that's ever existed from prehistory to the present day. They've shaped cultures, kick-started global trade, transformed our understanding of the mind, built empires and threatened the fabric of society.
What's interesting is, on the one hand, it's a universal impulse, but on the other hand, drugs are an acquired taste. Other people's drugs seem a bit kind of weird and often a bit disgusting and primitive. But, our own drugs are a bit like that. I doubt many people really enjoyed their first sip of beer or their first puff of a fag.
You had to work at it to get addicted to cigarettes, didn't you?
You have to work at it, and to work at it, you have to know that there is something worth pursuing at the end, and that idea of something worth pursuing, that's cultural. And, there'd be very little point in you or me learning how to chew betel here, because we'd be doing it on our own, whereas everybody else who choose it in a culture where people understand what it means. It's a bit like the equivalent of our cup of tea, that's more than just like a bit of caffeine. That's you're buying yourself 20 minutes of relaxation,
social time.
Sociability, yeah.
Right. Really, it was when things started to be kind of chemically manufactured that the sort of trouble began, as it were, wasn't it? Prior to that, they were just part of the ingredients, of life in some way. Apart from our worries about what other cultures do, say chewing betel nuts, it's got to do with pharmacology. And I want to come back at the end to hear your thoughts on Big Pharma and what they've done to our minds and the damage of that, because that's actually legalised.
Yeah, that's right. I guess here in Soho or in London or in Britain, the first example of that really was the gin craze in the 18th century, where suddenly people were distilling and it was mass-produced, really cheap, strong alcohol. There's a phase before that, which is really about the sort of beginnings of globalization, tobacco, tea, coffee, sugar, that's really the beginning of global trade. It was the trade in those that kind of linked the whole world up. And before that, I think, 500 years ago, every culture had their own drugs. You didn't really bother to take any other drugs that weren't, your national drugs, because it seemed weird and nobody would get it. They didn't really have to prohibit them. There was just no market for them. But then as soon as these drugs that come from one culture or another, like coffee from sort of Ethiopia or tobacco from the Americas, then this kind of clean little map that we had in the pre-global days, whatever, gets overlaid with all these other kind of global drugs. And adoption of them is often quite divisive. It was with all those things. There are the people who think smoking tobacco is great, and the people who like James the First, for example, who sort of thought it was a terrible barbarian habit. They become ways of dividing societies and, creating subcultures and countercultures, the people who do this and the people who don't. And I think that's the beginning of our kind of modern contested, drugs, are they good or are they bad, modern culture. But then on top of that, as you say, really accelerated once, scientists get going in the laboratory and go, okay, what's the chemical in this plant that really, does the trick? Well, let's just manufacture that pure and sell it cheap.
You mentioned it there, and that's another thing we should come back to, is the role that all these substances have played in trade.
Yeah.
So this country's got a very shameful past with regard to that, hasn't it? And you mentioned then coffee, of course, and, in these streets, Soho, and particularly down in St. James, the coffee house, the Georgian coffee house, where well-to-do men mainly went to socialise. When coffee came to this country, my friend Matt Green's thesis is that coffee was the start of the insurance business.
Right.
Because people would come to drink coffee, sort of gentlemen businessmen, and people would come in with news. And the news might be that some ship was foundered on the trade routes. This is the place where the whole concept of insurance got going, but it was pumped by caffeine.
It was a new type of venue. Before that, there was the tavern or the pub where you'd sit around and drink alcohol with everybody else. The coffee house created a space where what we might now call sort of white-collar people could get together. You were all sitting down and talking business, and you'd separated yourself from the sort of ale-swilling mob. We've got the same going on again with coffee now. You see all these people just out the window buzzing around Soho with their, flat white sort of motor that this intellectual smart world runs on.
Right, and of course chocolate too. Chocolate was one of the chocolate houses of St. James, but that was regarded as much more seedy. Actually, chocolate itself, it's whatever its psychoactive effects, it was associated much more with sex.
It's much more sort of sensual. There was a time when it came back into Spain from Mexico, only Jesuits were allowed chocolate.
Right.
There was a kind of prohibition on chocolate for the general public. There's been a bit of scholarship recently suggesting that coffee gave the initiative to kind of create a new social space.
But Mike, we've dived right in, and I wanted to take you right back in terms of your research and in terms of what you've written in High Societies. Let's go back as far as you can. How, in terms of a cultural thing, the ingestion of psychoactive substances to get high, at the beginnings of that.
It's kind of part and parcel of pretty much every society that's ever existed. Wherever we look and, wherever we go back, we've talked a bit about things like, betel nut chewing. That was very, very embedded in those Southeast Asian cultures.
Presumably for thousands of years, right?
Yeah, presumably. Right. The use of coca in the Andes, tobacco in a similar region. People thought maybe 2000 BC, but it's now looking more like 8 or 10,000 BC. And it's really just a question of how long material remains last. And of course, most drugs don't preserve very well. They rot away. There's a fantastic drug artifact, one of the first that we know of that I mention in the book, which was found, in the 1980s, quite recently, in the southern Andes in Argentina. And it's a puma bone that's been hollowed out into a pipe, so like a kind of chillum. And it had a residue inside. They scraped a little bit of it out and tested it, and DMT. DMT
being the active ingredient in things like ayahuasca.
That's right, yeah.
And in the book, you've got your very first image, actually, is indigenous people, consuming DMT in the form of ayahuasca, which is a kind of tea of made various vines and stuff. Presumably also went back for thousands, tens of thousands of years, right?
There are a lot of communities in the Amazon who use ayahuasca who probably weren't using it prior to the 19th century. Right. The spread of ayahuasca through the Amazon has probably got a lot to do with the incredibly brutal colonial project of rubber extraction. What's interesting about the puma bone pipe is you'd think, it shows you that smoking is not a recent thing. That actually, that goes way, way back. There are also people in the Amazon who still snort their DMT, and sort of ground down barks and seeds.
Yeah, you think you mentioned the Yanomami people? Blow it up a pipe up each other's noses, right?
That's right. I mean, if you went back 100, 150 years, that would probably have been much more widespread in the Amazon, and ayahuasca drinking much less.
What about betel? Have you tried it?
Yeah, I have. I've never really got the hang of betel. I'm very interested by these ones that have stayed in their culture and not spread. I mean, in contrast to tea and tobacco and things that have become global.
What is the culture of betel?
It goes quite a long way back, to the beginning of written records, and there's a courtly culture, the kings of Siam or Thailand and Khmers. They all had very distinctive styles of betel sets. It's a combination of things. There's the betel nut, which has got something kind of slightly nicotine-like in it. Then you wrap that in a leaf and you sprinkle a bit of lime on it, strong alkaline, to precipitate out the chemicals, and you make this little package, and you can put other things in there. And to do that, you need like a whole lot of implements, and you get these very fancy, beautiful sort of Burmese lacquered things, which are like hat boxes, but you open them up and inside there's lots of little compartments like a TV dinner and little spatulas and things for rolling things up, and this is where you keep the leaf, and it's a little gourd that you put the lime in. So there's something about betel nut that creates this very elaborate material culture, and then it becomes like any other consumer product, very stratified socially. A peasant will have just a very simple board, and a noble will have these amazing things with chased and filigreed sort of gold and silver and beautiful lacquer boxes. We had the same here with tobacco when tobacco pipes came in. If you're a peasant, you could smoke kind of just like with half a walnut and a straw would be your pipe. As you moved up the social and economic ladder, then pipes got more and more sort of elaborate and
longer,
demonstrative. Yeah, that's right.
I mean, you can still find clay pipes in the banks of the Thames. They're basically disposable. People would, for the lower end of the market, right? You buy your pre-stuffed pipe, smoke it, and then throw away the clay bit. This is just one example of the culture around these substances, isn't it? The artifacts and the art, of course, which they appreciated, right?
Yeah.
What about the coca leaf, which in its extracted form as cocaine and then crack, has swept through the world, also associated its trade with horrendous acts of violence and exploitation. But the coca leaf was, nibbled on, chewed on by working class people for thousands of years, wasn't it?
It still is. There are still kind of millions of traditional coca users. And what's interesting about that is it's so different from the way that we use cocaine, because in the Andes, it's really a working thing. You chew it. It's good for walking. It's good for physical work. If you haven't got time to take lunch, it kills your appetite. It keeps you going through the day. It's still kind of got a sacred quality. By the Incas, it was restricted to the nobility. So it's got that kind of bit of specialness to it. But here, cocaine, suddenly we've got the white powder, and we treat it completely differently. In fact, I think that we treat it like we treat alcohol.
Right.
As something to go out in the evening and have a bit of a celebration, a bit of a special one, maybe do a bit of damage to ourselves, but who cares?
You said it's like replace cheap champagne in the social scene.
Yeah, I think so. And that always used to be a marker of, this is a special night, let's kick off with a bottle of champagne. And that was always like a nice, luxurious, quite elite thing to do. But these days, lots of people use cocaine in the same way. It's a way of signalling that, we're going to have a luxurious bang-at-it evening out.
It'd be really annoying.
Yeah. And regret it the next morning, like alcohol.
You mentioned the sacred in terms of the coca leaf use. There's this great image in your book of this fellow, Carl Linnaeus, the traditional dress of the Sami people of Lapland in a scientific expedition. But what about the Laps? What were the Laps up to? One
of the cultures that didn't really have much in the way of psychoactive plants. So sort of as you go up towards the Arctic, of course, in some areas, including the Lap area, the only thing that was kind of really available up there was fly agaric, which was also used in shamanism in some cultures. It was eaten by reindeer who were sacred. So there was a bit of, in the same way that the Huichol people in Mexico associate the peyote with the deer. But in the absence of psychoactive plants, a lot of those Arctic, Siberian shamanic cultures developed techniques of drumming and sleep deprivation, which did much the same kind of thing. And then, of course, once alcohol and tobacco were available up there, they took to them straight away. So they're not like a different type of people. They just didn't have them available to them until modern times.
So let's just tick off that thing about the fly garret, because funny enough, I was walking through the woods in northern Scotland just a couple of days ago, and fly garret mushrooms everywhere. And I mentioned this to my companion and said, that's the mushroom that you get in Alice in Wonderland. They give her a mushroom and she suddenly feels very, very big, and then she suddenly feels very, very small. The caterpillar who's smoking a hookah pipe is sitting on a mushroom as well.
That's right.
But I said, but don't nibble on that one yourself, because fly garrets, they're kind of lethally poisonous, can melt your kidneys, right? Then you probably have to prepare them very carefully. But is it true that the Lapps fed them to reindeers and then drank the piss?
Yeah. There's a complex of different chemicals in there: muscarine, muscimol, ibotenic acid, some which are more poisonous than others. So mushrooms at different points in the season have a different balance of them. If you're up for that as a means of ingestion, then a lot of those toxins are filtered out by the kidneys. So the urine of somebody who's eaten magic mushrooms can be intoxicating, apparently less toxic. I've not tried it myself.
Drunk the piss of a reindeer yourself, mate. And of course, mushrooms is a very important part of these range of substances, isn't it? There's so many psychoactive mushrooms, or mushrooms with different psychoactive substances in them, grown in this country, naturally, and all over the world. Question which pops up for me, you're not a fungologist. Mycologist, yeah. But why do the plants produce psychoactive substances?
Yeah, that's a very good question. That, in a way, it sort of connects us back to the question of why do we take drugs. These all sort of have, I think, co-evolved with animal evolution. Plants didn't have very complex chemicals really until animals came along, and then you started to get these sort of pinene in conifers that tasted bitter and put animals off. But then we also know there are some quite good examples of chemicals in plants that attract insects and animals. So kind of the way I kind of think of it is, well, plants can't move, but they can kind of control the animal world around them. They can attract some things and repel others. So if we think of, the nightshades, which includes tobacco and chili, belladonna and datura and all those. That's a mixture of things that some of which put animals off and some of which attract them in. There have been studies done recently at Kew, actually, of bees, noting that caffeine-containing plants tend to get revisited by bees, maybe because the caffeine gives them a little memory boost and they remember where it came from. So I think there's a whole sort of dance going on there between the plant and the animal kingdom, where they kind of, these things emerge, and, they emerge just as part of sort of the organic chemistry of the plant, but some of them then prove useful, either as deterrents or as attractants.
Do you hold to the sort of Terence McKenna idea that human consciousness was propitiated itself by fungi, which possibly even came from another planet?
I think it all started kind of quite a long time before that. The animals that we, as humans, emerged from, apes and primates.
But an ape nibbling intentionally or unintentionally on a psychedelic plant, that might have triggered some spark or leap forward in consciousness, which then made it act slightly differently, a behaviour which then became advantageous in evolutionary terms.
What makes our use of drugs very different from other animals is our language and our symbolic culture, and that makes them suddenly much more interesting because, if something changes your consciousness, you can share that in all kinds of ways. You can incorporate it into your art, you can incorporate it into your sort of rituals and your group behaviour. When Terence McKenna wrote, there was this idea that we'd all emerged from this one tribe of apes on the African savannah, and now it seems like there were lots and lots of different populations in different parts of Africa. So I think, the question of how language and our symbolic thinking emerged is probably a bit more complicated than just eating a mushroom.
Right, we are animals, and you mentioned then possibly the bees, at Kew might be attracted to the caffeine-related plants, but do animals take drugs?
Yeah, the one that always fascinates me is cats and catnip.
Right.
Because catnip doesn't work on humans, so we don't really know.
Have you tried it?
No, I haven't. Do you think I should? I've never heard of anybody actually getting a human getting a psychoactive effect off it, but I've watched cats on catnip a lot, and that's kind of fascinating. And in fact, people have wired them up to brain scanners while they're on, and you see them head twitching and drooling a bit and often rolling around on the floor and kind of playing with something invisible, and, the brain brain scans show that they're kind of hallucinating us, they're acting as if there was something that they were playing with. And it may also be that it affects their sex drive. It might bring female cats into heat, for example. So there's a whole, it seems like kind of cat ecstasy, you know, it's got it's got all those dimensions to it. But of course, you know, even though we're very familiar with cats and they're part of our domestic world, we'll never know what catnip consciousness is like.
You mentioned then ritual, you mentioned sacred use of these substances. It still maintains in certain cultures, and I know that, you know, there's people here, as well as all the kind of crassness of the ayahuasca tourism, you know, that there are people who are actually using those substances now, you know, in a more kind of ritualized, sacred context, and for other purposes than entertainment, let's put it that way. Does that go back to the beginning too, this shamanic use of psychoactive substances, the use of them as to provoke religious experience or to provoke a mystical experience which might be useful for the tribe in some way or bring the tribe together? I mean, is that ancient?
I think it must be. There's sort of generalisation that, oh, why do we take drugs? Well, for pleasure, you know, which is true. You know, they all have a sensual and often pleasurable component, but that ayahuasca stuff is not pleasant.
I've never taken ayahuasca for pleasure. I've often not been pleasurable at all.
Yeah, exactly. But it does. I think the way it's conceived in Amazonian societies, you know, it gives you access to a different perspective, a non-human perspective. The jaguar or something, or the eagle or the anaconda, these top predators, you know,
or the plant.
That's right.
Plant consciousness.
But, you know, what have those top predators got that we haven't? They've got incredible night vision that we can't. They can move really fast. They're silent. They're deadly, you know. So if we can see the world from their perspective, then we're stepping up a little bit above our normal human capacity, you know. So, you know, that kind of instrumental use of drugs must be very old. That's not necessarily what we'd call a sacred practice, but I think it is in a way about sacredness or enchantment, at least. I think that's really the appeal of psychedelics, and particularly of psychedelics with those kind of indigenous roots, is that we're trapped here in our modernity and our kind of cage of materialism, and psychedelics kind of offer the promise of an escape from that. You know, this is like a state of consciousness in which other things become possible. You know, magical medical healing becomes possible, or, you know, we get transcendental glimpses of the world that we can't normally get as humans.
We also have the experience of early childhood, but as adults.
Yeah,
the wonder at the world, and of course also not feeling so separated from the world, which, you know, little kids don't feel separated from the world, right?
That's right.
You know, they've got a sort of natural, unself-conscious sense of wonder, curiosity. To be able to reconnect with that as an adult, as a bitter, cynical, bruised adult, it can be quite wonderful.
Yeah, that's absolutely great. A lot of the early sort of Western self-experimenters with peyote and things like that kind of always quoted Wordsworth when they say, what is it like? It's like we're back in this world, you know, where even sort of small mundane things all have their magic, and we're like we were as children in the world when everything was new to us, and we were all part of an experience, and we never had that adult curse of self-consciousness or self-reflection.
That's got something of the sacred of it, but it's not maybe as kind of religified, you know, in the same sort of way. It's not necessarily in the context of, you know, rituals and priests, priestesses and stuff. Recently in Greece, in Epidavros, with a friend of Sarah Jane's, actually, maybe. She was talking about how at the Temple of Asclepius, which is a temple of healing, they're now speculating that in the dream incubation chamber, they may have actually been using fumes, you know, which were psychoactive, to encourage the sick people to dream, you know, to dream of Asclepius and to dream of what their healing might be. So there are these contexts where they were deliberately used for the purposes of changing something.
Yeah, that's right. Long time been speculation about that with oracles, like the Pythian oracle that were kind of sat over faults where, you know, gases and fumes emerged. Looking back from our modern perspective, it's kind of, there are so many historical scenes that we could easily inject drugs into, and we're very tempted to do that because drugs have this quality for us of enchantment. Then we tend to look back and think, well, these people can't just have been sitting in a room, you know, muttering mumbo jumbo and having a transformative experience. There must have been a drug in there, and I think often there wasn't a drug in there. But but also there are clearly cases where they were. I mean, if you go back to the beginning of, you know, early sort of the Rig Veda, you know, in the beginning of the Indo-European tradition, there's soma, which is kind of described, you know, very mythologically and symbolically in ways that are hard to interpret, but it does seem like it is actually, you know, a physical brew that's made and drunk, and it takes people to another dimension or whatever.
One of the reasons that we may want to find that in these situations that there was some mind-altering substance involved too, because we want to do what your book is telling us, which is that we want to put this experience into a wider human, cultural, historical experience. That it's not just about what the law says it's about, or what science says it's about, or what even we personally think it's about. Haven't we got this instinct that there is something fundamentally human about the use of these things, and that's why we hope to have that belief validated somehow.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So I think magic mushrooms are probably quite a good example here. I mean, as you say, we know that, the little Liberty cat mushrooms grew in Britain and have done for ages, and I've looked for years and never found any evidence of people really using them deliberately. But what you do find is examples of what are categorised as accidental poisonings, of people who eat a mushroom and then they start to feel a bit funny and they get worried that they've poisoned themselves. And if they have what we might think of as hallucinations, they'll say, I got a delirium and getting confused. And then usually they end up either having enemas or getting their stomach pumped, or it becomes like a medical emergency, I think what happened in the sort of 50s, in the first psychedelic era, after Gordon Wasson went to Mexico and discovered Maria Sabina using them in a traditional manner, which we then had a story, and the story was, mushrooms are really ancient, and long before Christianity there was a kind of global mushroom cult, and people have used them, for sacred purposes for millennia. Oh, and incidentally, at the same time, science, Albert Hofmann says, oh yes, they do contain this new chemical called psilocybin that we didn't know about. So they're at the same time, they're deeply ancient and mystical, but also cutting edge, neurochemistry. And then once we've got that idea for them, then we can start to have, productive and, fascinating mushroom trips. Once we know there's something to shoot for, and we know that first feeling in your stomach is not, I've been poisoned. It's like, wow, I'm about to go on a really profound journey.
It's like going over the first bit on the roller coaster.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And suddenly we can have our own mushroom culture, and we can all share that, and we can express it in music and in art, and
You mentioned Britain then, and apart from Liberty Cap, what about Datura and Salvia, and is it ergot and rotten bread and stuff?
Yes, ergot, yeah. That was certainly around in Europe, and it was used quite widely, particularly in Germany, in sort of medieval medicine, and that's what old Albert Hofmann was looking for when he found LSD, was, because it's a vasoconstrictor, and, so it was used a lot in sort of birthing and postpartum hemorrhage and stopping blood flow and all that kind of thing. We had those kind of, what we call them, the nightshades, belladonna and mandrake, and they were used a bit in medicine, but of course opium we knew about. But I think that's one of the funny things that comes up when you look at this global picture, is that all these drugs that were indigenous to Europe are all down the dark narcotic and the sort of toxic end of the spectrum. But we didn't have, these sort of coca leaves and cats and all these stimulants, let alone any of these, cacti and native psychedelics. Western culture emerged out of this pharmacopoeia, where drugs were kind of a bit dark and toxic. And old Linnaeus, who you mentioned, was maybe the first person to look around the world and document the different ways that people use different mind-altering plants, and say, well, look, we've all got our own different drugs.
Here is a sidebar about Cava. That's Cava with a K, not the budget champagne. The sun sets across the islands of the South Pacific, the most remote outposts of humanity. Here, almost all the drugs consumed by the rest of the world remain unknown. Even alcohol and tobacco are costly imports, rare outside the urban centres. But from the middle of the afternoon, the men have been drifting in from their gardens and plantations to grate, chew and soak kava root for their evening brew. As the sun sets, they congregate in huts to drink it from coconut shells and share some whispered conversation, or squat alone on the beach to listen to its voice in the surf as the sunset fades to darkness. Kava is a narcotic drink produced by grinding and soaking the root tubers of Piper methysticum, a large plant of the pepper family. Since it must be drunk fresh, preparing kava is a process that consumes a significant proportion of every day. Roots must be rubbed clean with coconut husks, stripped, peeled and shredded, these days usually with an old cheese grater, into a plastic bowl. But in the most traditional villages, by chewing the root and spitting the macerated pulp into a banana leaf. Once prepared, the drink is poured into coconut shells, which are knocked back quickly and cleanly. Although kava has an exalted cultural status, it is still not reckoned to taste very nice. It is a muddy, pale brown suspension with a peppery burn and a distinctive numbing effect on the lips and throat. Other effects soon follow. A fullness in the head, a rush of warm feelings and a clumsy, stumbling gait. Sounds become louder and light harsher. It's good manners to whisper amongst fellow drinkers and to dim paraffin lamps. After a few hours of gentle trance, it promotes a sound night's sleep, making it a better complement to working routines than alcohol. In equally marked contrast to alcohol, which has had destructive effects on many Pacific cultures, kava encourages positive social behaviours, generosity, sensitivity, cordial conversation, and comfortable silence. For these reasons, kava is an ancient and essential element, both symbolic and practical in social interaction. Kava drinking, like the Native American peace pipe, is a communion through which friendly relations are established, contracts sealed, and hostilities set aside. Kava roots are exchanged as gifts between neighbours, and more formally between families at weddings and funerals. Whether drunk or exchanged, the presence of kava signals a hiatus in rivalries and social tensions, and an opportunity for a fresh start in individual or group relations. Once the big men or elders of rival groups have formally made peace in a kava ceremony, all resentments are truly dead and buried. For the cultures that use it, kava also serves as a sacred conduit to their ancestral inheritance. Alongside its public and social role, this private aspect of kava is highly valued. It is at dusk, regarded in Melanesia as a time of especially strong ancestral presence, that kava ceremonies are held. It is drunk in graveyards to allow the living to listen to the voices of the departed. Revelations received in this way are not taken as the utterance of one who heard them, but as messages from a deeper source. In this sense, kava drinking allows individuals to act as disembodied oracles for the community at large. We've had wine, we've had beer in the West, haven't we? And that's been the mind-altering drug of choice for millennia here, right? Isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
And as you said right at the beginning, because it's just part of our culture, we don't even regard it as such generally, you know.
No, that and opium, which we now think of opium as being kind of oriental, but actually, you know, the first recorded opium use is Germany and Switzerland and in the Neolithic period, and then of course by the time of the Cretan civilization and classical Greece it was used medicinally quite a lot. In Egypt there's references to it in sort of ancient Egyptian sources like the Ebers papyrus. So opium and alcohol are really, you know, from this part of the world.
Mentioning opium can't help but remind me of the Opium Wars, a particularly shady incident amongst many shady incidents of this country, but it links us into another part of the book, which is to do with the trade in these substances, which has propelled huge economic shifts and growths and had all sorts of consequences, many of which you could say have been good, right? And
yeah, that's right. I mean, what I tried to do in the book and the exhibition was to sort of first of all look at drugs as kind of cultural artifacts, and then to look at them within medicine, and then the third thing is to look at drugs as commodities, and drugs are valuable commodities, you know. So there's they're a big part of trade and the beginning of this global network that we talked about. What happened with Britain was that a couple of things happened simultaneously. One was that what was then Bengal fell into British hands, and that had the richest opium plantations on the planet, which East India Company developed as a kind of big agribusiness. They've found all the opium farmers and gave them cash up front for their seed and guaranteed to buy their crop, and really something that had been kind of quite chaotic and disorganized became like a real classic British 19th century imperial economic project. And part of that was about the fact that opium was being more widely used in Britain. We traditionally got our opium from turkeys, but it was a valuable commodity. But then it turned out to be the key to breaking into this huge market of China. There was so much stuff from China that we wanted. We wanted their silk, we wanted their porcelain, and there was really nothing that we had that they wanted except silver. So the British Exchequer was handing over boatloads of silver to the Chinese in exchange for their tea, which was the other thing that we kind of crucially needed from them. So it suddenly became possible to, we don't have to pay for all this tea with silver, as tea became a British habit. We can pay for it with opium instead. Only problem being that the Chinese emperor had outlawed the use of opium, which he saw as sort of foreign and toxic and dangerous in the way that people tend to with foreign drugs. We decided, well, we won't deal with the emperor. I think plenty of people want opium in China, so we'll just deal with the opium smugglers. And this trade opened up with these really fast kind of predatory ships, a bit like those kind of shiny black speedboats that buzz across sort of the Straits of Gibraltar with tobacco and the cannabis. Sort of British merchant vessels magically appeared to transfer these enormous amounts of opium from Bengal and sell them to smugglers off the coast of China. And
feed the habit of many, many Chinese who were using opium, right?
That's right, who had been using opium, before the British. The Dutch had been doing this before. And then opium kind of through the 19th century in China became, one of these very socialised, stratified substances like betel nut, where there were cheap places where peasants could go and smoke opium, but then there were also these, wonderful opium houses, very luxurious, and it became a place where civil servants would all, sit around and hang out after around a pipe of opium. And if you're wealthy enough, you'd have your own opium chef in your home when you'd invite your friends round and do the session there. So that whole Chinese elaboration of opium culture, in the end, we became the suppliers for it.
And when the emperor objected, for various reasons, we decided to enforce it.
Yeah, hence the Opium Wars, which we'd been kind of looking for an excuse anyway, because free trading Britain, we wanted to be buccaneering global free traders, and the Emperor of China wasn't allowing us to trade with China. And then when they started destroying our opium, then we sent our gunships, which they had no idea of, suddenly went kind of steaming up their rivers, and we started bombing all their harbours to rubble and making them surrender and making them adopt our free trade policies and giving us Hong Kong to operate out of.
That's where we got Hong Kong. And of course, this aspect of the drug as the commodity, it's playing out now catastrophically, isn't it, around the world. You think about in South America, the Colombia and Venezuela and Mexico, that the drug cartels, who wreak unbelievable violence upon each other and on the people around them. It's a very dirty part of the story, isn't it?
It's playing out not just kind of as drugs as commodities, but drugs as illegal commodities, prohibited commodities. So, if you look at the coffee trade in Latin America, it's not very different from the coca trade. Often the people who are growing coffee are the same people who are growing coca. They grow in the same part of the world at the same altitude, and people switch from one to another depending on the value. That's the cocaine market is flooded at the moment. There's probably people moving back to coffee. And you wouldn't say that coffee growers in Latin America get a particularly fair shake, but they're certainly better off than the coca farmers who have no choice but to sell at gunpoint to gangsters. It's the prohibition and the illicit trade that creates a lot of this chaos and crime and violence.
And we're hearing now that in the Middle East that various terrorist groups are weaponizing opium. I think ISIS and Taliban, although they disapprove of its use, are actually using it to gain revenue, but also as a way of undermining other people that they don't like, because if you can make a lot of other people into junkies and drug addicts, it kind of has a deleterious effect on their cultures, right?
Yeah, and if you're if you're a rebel army, I mean, this was the old golden triangle up there. How do you get hard currency? How do you get US dollars? If you're a terrorist organisation and no one wants to deal with you, the drug trade is an obvious way. And I think this is happening a lot in places like Lebanon and Syria, for example, with Captagon, this amphetamine, which is very much part of the war economy there. It's huge and it's taken quite widely, in the Arab world, whereas alcohol is forbidden. It's much less conspicuous if you're taking it, and so there's a lot of that kind of illicit amphetamine circulating there as well.
Yeah, and also with something like Captagon, it's been used by soldiers because they can tolerate high levels of pain and hardship. They'd be braver. Substance has been weaponised, right? That's
right, which was, the one with the broadest, longest history of that, of course, is alcohol. I mean, alcohol is incredibly valuable in war, not just the Dutch courage, but also, getting together for a drink and group bonding and relaxing afterwards and managing trauma. And, it's like, if you're trying to keep lots of people at war, you want to keep a steady flow of alcohol going. But, particularly since the Second World War, then you've also got methamphetamine, obviously, during the Second World War, and now Captagon. That's another context in which drugs emerge as kind of powerful instrumental allies, if you like.
So there's all that been going on, but as we circle back towards the beginning, which we were talking about, where in the last sort of century or so, where these substances were first of all kind of extracted and the basic root chemicals identified and produced cheaply. The criminalisation of some of them for various reasons. It's very obvious reading the book that the trade, the commodity of it is connected completely to the fact that they've been criminalised.
Yeah, that's right.
So the fact that there's what's going on in Colombia with the drug cartels is a result of two things: people's innate desire to use these substances, and the fact that people who rule over them have made them illegal.
Yeah, that's right. It's supply and demand. It's the same. If you look at alcohol prohibition in the United States, it's the same dynamic playing out. If the demand for something is just starting, you can probably kind of clamp down on the supply and stop it, nip it in the bud. But once there's, a well-established demand, it will find a supply, and if the legal supply is choked off, then the illegal supply will do the business.
And yet still doesn't seem to be being acknowledged. That's the strange thing about it. But you have said something in the new introduction to iSociety. When you wrote it, this book was a bit of an outlier. It wasn't talking about drugs in terms of addiction. It wasn't talking about them in terms of criminality. It was talking about them culturally, historically. And at the time, that was a bit out there. And yet, 14 years later, well, that isn't really out there anymore because the cultural attitudes towards them have shifted, despite the fact that the war on drugs sort of weirdly rolls on. Things are very different now, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. I mean, certainly things like cannabis, that was 14 years ago. Apart from coffee shops in Amsterdam, cannabis was a drug and it was all illegal. And now, over 100 million Americans can just go to their local dispensary and buy it. And they always used to call it marijuana, which always sounded really sort of sinister and foreign and criminal. And cannabis to Americans sounds much more neutral and scientific, so that's kind of what they all call it now. And it's become quite culturally well established, and people talk about it as a medicine more. Right. They don't talk about it as a drug. So it shows you that this category of drug is not it's not really defined by the chemistry. It's defined by our attitudes towards it. The world's become very divided. There's Europe and Latin America moving towards decriminalisation, looking for legal markets for cannabis and maybe for mushrooms and psychedelics as well. And on the other hand, you've got Russia, China, the Gulf states, who are absolutely still kind of on the old prohibitionist hymn book and vetoing any attempts to soften the laws. But yeah, within the half of the world that we're in at the moment, it's no longer the thing of you've got your drugs either from a doctor with a prescription or from some dodgy guy on the street. There are so many in-betweens now. And
yet, it still remains incredibly complicated because there's been this whole new generation of drugs, which have had nothing to do with the ancient world, nothing to do with ancient cultures at all. They've been completely synthesised. They're sort of knocking them out week by week, new variations on a theme. The sort of law's kind of desperately chasing after them, so you get ridiculous things like Theresa May sort of just banning psychoactive substances, forgetting about coffee and alcohol. And I feel quite mixed up about it myself. I'm quite clear on some things. I mean, I feel like a cognitive libertarian when it's in principle, so that I don't think the state has the right or the duty to interfere with my consciousness or what I want to put in my body or not, right? But when you look at, say, on what's going on in Portland with pharmacological substances, some of which were legal, and the kind of damage that it's wreaking, it's difficult to hold to that position. I don't know about you, but I still feel completely clear that the possession and use of any substance should not be a criminal matter. It should be a matter of education. Whether dealing in that stuff and manufacturing of it should be illegal, I think is definitely up for debate.
I think part of the problem is, drug market is the ultimate free market, because it's illegal. There's no regulations,
Right.
There's no controls. So, but on the other hand, it's not really a free market in the sense that we don't really get to choose the drugs we want. We get the drugs that the cartels push at us.
Right.
There's no real demand for fentanyl. People are not going, oh, wow, I thought, heroin is great, but fentanyl is so much better. It's like, if you want an opiate, then fentanyl is what's on offer.
And it's on offer in a way which is completely uncontrolled. You don't know what the dose is. You don't know what else is mixed in with it, right? Because
That's
you're buying
right.
it on the street. Come from maybe some lab in China or something.
Yeah, whereas if you go into a cannabis retailer in the States, it'll tell you exactly what percentage of CBD and THC is in it and how many milligrams of this and that. When you've got a controlled market, I think that becomes much safer. So I think in a way we've got a situation where, there's a generation of people who are not being given that information. A bit like social media, where suddenly it's all over us and we don't really understand what's legal or what isn't. And you can't just keep going free speech, because, there's so many obvious abuses of that going on. You would hope that two things would happen. One thing would be governments would regulate all this stuff a bit better. And the other would be that people, after a while, would get the hang of it a bit more and be able to sort the wheat from the chaff and be able to find what they wanted more.
Right, they wouldn't be need to be driven to hideous things like trank and spice.
Yeah.
Let's not forget the villains in the piece when it comes to Big Pharma, the ones who pumped OxyContin and other opiate-related medicines onto people, who then became addicted to them and stuff, and that's wreaked enormous legal havoc, right?
Yeah, the FDA and all the sort of bodies of regulators, obviously they get very close with the big pharmaceutical companies, and the big pharmaceutical companies work out how to jump through the hoops and how to, tick all the boxes. And the answer to that is really just government agencies being smarter and regulating more tightly and obviously not being corrupt and in the pockets of big pharma and big capital.
Finally, in terms of why we take drugs and, why some people think we shouldn't, right? Whether they be the lawmakers or the priests, the people who've got a religious, ideologically based. That's the bit that I've never really understood, actually, is that why some religions, for instance, think it's unethical to do this stuff. Buddhism, actually, and I'm largely a practicing Buddhist, is one of them, interestingly. It's got it's got an ethical downer on intoxicants.
Oh, very much so, yeah.
And it's odd, isn't it, really? Because given the fact that, your thesis, the thesis of high society, is that this is an integral part of the human experience, right the way back. It's all over nature. It's all over every culture. It's odd, isn't it, that
it is.
That some take this stance against it, this prohibitive, not just because it might be physically bad for you, or you might get addicted, and we know that happens, but that you should not do it to your mind, and I'm going to stop you doing it. That's the bit that's always grated with me.
And I think it's because drugs expand our subjectivity. There's a sense in which drugs and religion compete for the same patch, for the same part of our minds. And I think if you've got a religion that is based on the idea that these are the precepts that you must follow, this is the path that you must follow, drugs are not going to contribute to you following that path in most cases. When they do, it's very much about cultural identity. If you look at the Native American church who use peyote in their ceremonies, that's very much about keeping their culture going, and that was what helped their culture to survive forced captivity on the reservations. If you look at, say, the Santo Daime Church in Brazil, the Catholic Church that uses ayahuasca, that's really appealing to a whole generation of people whose parents or grandparents, came from the Amazon, but who they don't really have any connection to that indigenous spirituality. But this gives them a bit of that within Christianity. Right. So I think sometimes they can work together because they create bonds and, form a community in a way way that works together with religion. But I think in other contexts, in religious traditions which don't have that kind of exploration of consciousness at the centre of them, then drugs are kind of a rival for the affections of the people.
Who polices our consciousness?
I mean, like you, I think we should be free to experiment, but then you have to acknowledge that life is such that people only get one shot, and drugs can take you off in terrible directions, often really quite fast, including alcohol, along with everything else.
Education is crucial. Set and setting, as they would have said in the 60s. It's a very risky world to dabble in. There's no sacred value in that.
I mean, that was one of the great things that emerged from the early internet. There's sites like erowid.org where everybody posts their drug experiences, and there's good, reliable, factual information there. I think people do have better tools to navigate this, and of course it's the people who crash and burn who you hear most about, and that's where the tragic stories are. Right. But I mean, I think certainly with psychedelics now, young people coming to psychedelics with a sense that this can be, part of a wellness regime, and you can do it seriously and sensibly. It's not so much the thing of having a sheet of blotter acid and gobbling it down and heading out into town to see what happens. I think people have become more intentional, and the culture that's emerging, as you say, it's undeniably scary sides, but it also has a maturity that I think is good to see.
So, kids, when it comes to educating yourself on drugs, just say yes. And do this at home. And one of the ways to do that would be to read Mike's wonderful book, High Society, Mind-Altering Drugs in History and Culture. A cult classic, I would say. Mike, thanks very much for coming back to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Oh, a real pleasure, Stephen. Thanks.
Terrific stuff. I'll put a link to Mike's book, High Society, Mind-Altering Drugs in History and Culture, published by Thames and Hudson, in the show notes, of course, and a link to his other work. Do check it out, actually. He's written many books, as we discussed, not just about psychoactive substances, but about sanity and insanity in the culture. Very good stuff. I hope I don't come across as some huge proponent of drug taking. I don't feel that way at all, actually, but I do feel it's a complicated countercultural area that benefits from these kind of conversations, which are also fascinating as well as enlightening. Maybe helps us move to a better position than we've held in our societies, high or low, for the last century. Now, I hope you enjoyed this. Do let us know. It's always good to hear from people. bureauoflostculture.com. And you can sign up for our Bulletin of Lost Culture. There's various things coming up in 2025 which I'm psyched about, and we'll be announcing via the Bulletin fairly soon. Right, I hope to see you, hear you, meet you further down the road, round the bend, and over the hillsides for more tales from the counterculture, from the underground. Let's finish with a tune. Wolfie's Diner from the album Junk Shop Melodies by the Clockenwell Kid.